The notification appeared on Detective James Morrison's computer screen at exactly 9:43 a.m. on a gray November morning in 2024. After 21 years working cold cases for the Illinois State Police, he had learned to recognize the weight of certain moments before they fully registered in his conscious mind. The CODIS database match had been sitting in his inbox for less than 7 minutes, but something about the case number made his coffee go cold in his hand. Mitchell, Katherine Rose. Missing since October 3rd, 1969. File last updated 2018. Morrison leaned back in his chair, the harsh office lights of the Springfield headquarters casting sharp angles across the manila folders that perpetually cluttered his desk. 55 years. He had worked cases that stretched back decades, but nothing quite like this. In 1969, DNA was still locked away in university laboratories. The double helix had been decoded, but the idea that microscopic genetic material could solve crimes belonged to science fiction, not police work. Yet here on his monitor was irrefutable proof that David Allen Brenner's DNA matched biological evidence collected from a 17-year-old girl's torn clothing in rural Livingston County, Illinois, more than half a century ago. The match shouldn't have been possible. But what made Morrison's hands tremble slightly as he reached for his phone was the date stamp on Brenner's DNA collection. April 2024. 6 months ago. Routine traffic stop in the same county where Katherine Mitchell had vanished. David Allen Brenner, age 73, had provided a saliva sample for an unrelated DUI investigation. Standard procedure under Illinois expanded collection protocols. His genetic profile had been entered into the system in May, and the algorithms had been running comparisons ever since. Morrison pulled up Katherine Mitchell's file, watching the black and white photographs load on his outdated system. A young face stared back at him from a homecoming dance photo taken just 2 weeks before the disappearance. Katherine had been a senior at Livingston Central High School, honor student, daughter of corn farmers Margaret and Thomas Mitchell. She had vanished on a Friday afternoon while riding her bicycle home from her part-time job at Henderson's hardware store, along the same rural route she had taken 3 times a week for 8 months. If you're following this investigation right now, pause for just a second and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is at your location. Drop it in the comments below, and while you're there, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next, in this case, is going to change everything we thought we knew about cold cases and the predators who thought they got away with murder. The original investigation file was thicker than most from that era. Nearly 6 inches of reports, witness statements, and search documentation. Sheriff Robert Walsh had been thorough by 1969 standards, but the tools available to him were primitive compared to modern forensic capabilities. No cell phone records to trace, no security cameras to review, no digital footprints to follow. Just physical evidence, witness testimony, and the gut instincts of investigators who understood that time was their enemy. Morrison found himself staring at the evidence inventory list, typed on an old manual typewriter with letters that struck unevenly against yellowed paper. Item 11. Female blouse, white cotton, torn at collar and left sleeve. Unknown biological material collected from fabric. Item 12. Fabric fragments. Location Southwest Corner Highway 116 and County Road 1850. Collected in evidence bags 12A through 12E. What struck him was not what was listed, but what the original investigators couldn't have known. They were looking at those unknown biological samples, not understanding that they contained genetic material that would remain undetectable for another 15 years. The fabric fragments held traces of skin cells that would become the key to solving Katherine Mitchell's disappearance. But only after technologies that didn't exist in 1969 could finally read the story written in molecules invisible to the human eye. Morrison picked up his phone and dialed his supervisor, Captain Helen Rodriguez. This wasn't just another cold case match. This was something that would shake Livingston County to its foundation. David Allen Brenner wasn't just alive. He was living less than 4 miles from where Katherine Mitchell had disappeared in 1969. He had a wife, 3 grown children, and 6 grandchildren. He coached Little League Baseball for 15 years. He served on the County Planning Commission. He was the kind of man everyone in town knew by name. And in approximately 6 hours, Morrison would be placing him under arrest for murder. Margaret Mitchell woke that Friday morning to the sound of her husband Thomas's truck starting in the gravel driveway below. The October air carried the scent of harvested fields and wood smoke through the open bedroom window of their 2-story farmhouse, located 5 miles west of Chatsworth, on what locals simply called Mitchell Farm Road. The gravel drive stretched nearly 3/4 of a mile from the house to the main road, lined with oak trees that Thomas's grandfather had planted in 1927. Everything about that morning would later be dissected, analyzed, and remembered with the painful precision that comes only after normal moments become evidence. Katherine had been unusually talkative during breakfast, chattering about the homecoming dance that was scheduled for the following weekend, and whether she should wear the blue dress or the green one. At 17, Katherine was developing the confident independence that often accompanies teenagers who maintain part-time jobs and save money for college. She had been accepted to Illinois State University for the following fall, with plans to study elementary education. Her guidance counselor had written in a recommendation letter that Katherine possessed an uncommon combination of academic excellence and genuine warmth that would make her an exceptional teacher. She wore her favorite white cotton blouse over dark jeans, the same blouse she had ironed carefully the night before while listening to the radio in her bedroom. The bicycle ride to Henderson's hardware store should have taken Katherine exactly 22 minutes. She had timed it herself during her first week of employment, pedaling the winding rural route that connected their farm to the small commercial district, where the hardware store sat between the post office and Murphy's Diner. The route took her along Mitchell Farm Road to the intersection with County Road 1850, then north for 2 miles before turning east on Highway 116 for the final stretch into Chatsworth proper. It was a journey she had made 3 times a week for 8 months, through summer heat and autumn chill, past the Brenner property with its weathered red barn and collapsing fence lines, beyond the old Jacobson farm with its distinctive white silos, and finally into town, where the rural quiet gave way to the sounds of small-town Friday afternoon routines. Thomas Mitchell kissed his daughter goodbye at 2:30 p.m., noting the time because he had been watching the grain prices scroll across the bottom of the television screen. Katherine worked the late afternoon shift on Fridays, 4 hours that allowed her to help with the weekend inventory at the hardware store while still maintaining her academic commitments. Her employer, Gerald Henderson, had told Margaret just the previous week that Katherine was the most reliable employee he had hired in 23 years of running the business. Margaret watched from the front porch as Katherine pedaled down the long driveway, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that bounced with each push of the bicycle pedals. That image would become Margaret's most treasured and most torturous memory. Her daughter disappearing around the curve in the oak-lined driveway, one hand lifted in a casual wave, completely unaware that she was riding toward an encounter that would steal her life and destroy her family. The first indication that something was wrong came at 7:15 p.m. when Katherine failed to arrive home from her shift at Henderson's hardware store. Katherine had never missed her expected arrival time without calling ahead. Margaret had prepared Katherine's favorite dinner, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the way her daughter had requested that morning. When 7:30 came and went, Margaret called the hardware store. Gerald Henderson answered on the third ring, confusion evident in his voice when he explained that Katherine had left the store at 6:45 p.m., exactly on schedule. She had seemed perfectly normal, cheerful even, talking about the homecoming dance as she clocked out and retrieved her bicycle from the back storage area. By 8 p.m., Thomas Mitchell was driving Katherine's bicycle route in his pickup truck, his headlights cutting through the October darkness, searching the ditches and shoulders for any sign of his daughter. Margaret sat beside him, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Neither of them spoke, both understanding that every minute that passed without finding Katherine increased the likelihood that something terrible had happened. The bicycle was discovered at 8:47 p.m. by Dale Jacobson, whose farm bordered Highway 116. Jacobson had been driving home from a county board meeting when his headlights caught the reflection of metal lying in the tall grass near the intersection with County Road 1850. The bicycle was on its side, the front wheel still slowly spinning as if it had been abandoned just moments before. Katherine's work bag remained strapped to the rear rack, her time card from Henderson's hardware store still inside, marked with the 6:45 p.m. departure stamp. But what made Jacobson immediately pull over and approach the scene with a growing sense of dread was the white cotton blouse lying 15 feet from the bicycle, torn at the collar and left sleeve, the fabric showing clear signs of violent struggle. The blouse was the same one Katherine had been wearing that afternoon. Jacobson had seen her pedaling past his property at approximately 6:50 p.m., had even waved to her as he checked his mailbox. Sheriff Robert Walsh received the call at 9:03 p.m., interrupting the Friday night high school football game where he had been watching his nephew play quarterback. At 54 years old, Walsh had spent 28 years with the Livingston County Sheriff's Department, dealing primarily with agricultural accidents, occasional domestic disputes, and the predictable troubles that came with rural communities and seasonal harvest workers. Nothing in his career had prepared him for what he understood immediately upon seeing Katherine Mitchell's abandoned bicycle and torn clothing. This was an abduction, and the clock was already ticking against them. Walsh assembled every available deputy within 30 minutes, his 3 full-time officers and 2 part-timers who normally worked only weekends. By 10 p.m., they had established a perimeter around the discovery site and were conducting preliminary searches with flashlights and vehicle-mounted spotlights. The fall darkness made systematic searching nearly impossible, but Walsh understood that waiting until morning could mean the difference between finding Katherine alive or not finding her at all. Thomas and Margaret Mitchell arrived at the scene at 10:26 p.m., having been notified by Walsh's deputy. Margaret collapsed when she saw Katherine's torn blouse being photographed as evidence. Thomas caught her before she hit the ground, but the anguished sound that came from Margaret's throat would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. It was the sound of a mother who understood in that moment that her daughter was not coming home. The initial search expanded rapidly as word spread through Chatsworth and the surrounding communities. By midnight, nearly 60 volunteers had assembled at the intersection, responding to calls from the sheriff's department and the volunteer fire department. The temperature had dropped to 42 degrees, and a light rain had begun to fall, making conditions miserable for searchers. But no one complained. They formed search lines and walked systematic grid patterns, calling Katherine's name into the October darkness. What none of them knew as they searched through that long, terrible night was that Katherine Mitchell was already dead, her body concealed in a location that would remain hidden for 55 years. And the man responsible for her death was among the volunteers helping with the search, appearing concerned and helpful. Just another neighbor doing his civic duty. David Allen Brenner, age 23, had joined the search party at approximately 11:30 p.m. He told Sheriff Walsh that he had heard about the missing girl on his police scanner radio and wanted to help. He walked the search lines, called Katherine's name, and even brought thermoses of hot coffee for other volunteers at 3 a.m. Nobody suspected that the man working beside them had Katherine Mitchell's blood on his hands. The rain continued through Saturday morning, turning the search area into a muddy maze of cornfields and drainage ditches. Sheriff Walsh had contacted the Illinois State Police at 4:30 a.m., understanding that his small department lacked the resources and expertise to handle an abduction case. State Police Detective Lieutenant Frank Kowalski arrived from Springfield at 7:15 a.m., bringing with him crime scene technicians and bloodhounds borrowed from the state penitentiary. Kowalski was a methodical investigator who had worked kidnapping cases in Chicago before transferring to the State Police Violent Crimes Unit. But the rural setting presented unique challenges. The vast open farmland meant that a perpetrator could have transported Katherine in any direction with minimal risk of being observed. The lack of streetlights, security cameras, or significant traffic during evening hours meant that witness accounts would be scarce at best. The bloodhounds picked up Katherine's scent from her bedroom and followed it along her bicycle route, confirming the path to where her bicycle and torn blouse had been discovered. But the dogs lost the trail at the intersection itself, circling repeatedly at the spot where the evidence had been found before sitting down in confusion. The scent simply ended there, suggesting that Katherine had been forced into a vehicle that left no trace on the rain-soaked gravel shoulder. By Saturday afternoon, the search had expanded to include more than 200 volunteers. Farmers suspended their weekend work to join the effort, bringing tractors and equipment that could cover ground faster than people on foot. The Livingston County Civil Defense Coordinator organized the volunteers into systematic search teams, assigning each group specific sections of farmland, woodland, and drainage areas to cover. The Methodist Church in Chatsworth established a command center providing coffee, sandwiches, and coordination for the massive effort. FBI involvement came on Sunday when Special Agent Richard Barnes opened a federal investigation under the assumption that Katherine might have been transported across state lines. Barnes was experienced in kidnapping cases, but he immediately recognized the challenges presented by the rural location and the 48-hour delay since Katherine's disappearance. Statistics showed that abduction victims who weren't recovered within the first 24 hours faced dramatically reduced survival odds. Walsh documented everything with obsessive attention to detail, filling out reports in his careful handwriting and photographing evidence with the department's Polaroid camera. Every tire track in the mud near the roadside, every cigarette butt found within a quarter mile of the scene, every scrap of fabric caught on fence wire was collected and cataloged. Most would prove irrelevant, but Walsh understood that missing a crucial detail could mean the difference between solving the case and watching it fade into the archives of unsolved disappearances. The evidence that would ultimately solve Katherine's case 55 years later was collected on Sunday afternoon by Illinois State Police forensic technician Robert Martinez, whose meticulous methods would prove crucial decades into the future. Martinez used tweezers and magnifying equipment to remove fibers from the torn sections of Katherine's white blouse that appeared inconsistent with the blouse's own cotton composition. Under the magnification available in 1969, these fibers appeared to be denim-based fabric in a dark blue color, possibly from work clothing or heavy canvas material. Martinez also collected fabric fragments from the ground near where Katherine's bicycle was discovered, some caught on barbed wire fencing that lined the property boundaries, others embedded in the gravel and mud of the road shoulder. These fragments were carefully sealed in evidence bags, labeled with Martinez's precise handwriting, noting exact locations, measurements, and environmental conditions at the time of collection. The biological material that Martinez observed on some fragments was noted in his reports, but the technology to analyze it properly wouldn't exist for another 15 years. By the end of the first week, the intensive search had covered more than 70 square miles. The FBI had interviewed more than 400 people, including every male resident between the ages of 15 and 65, within a 20-mile radius of where Katherine's bicycle was found. They checked backgrounds of recent parolees, transient workers who had been in the area during harvest season, and anyone with any history of contact with minors. David Allen Brenner was interviewed on October 9th, less than a week after Katherine's disappearance. Deputy Tom Richardson conducted the interview at Brenner's family property, noting in his report that Brenner, age 23, had been cooperative and forthcoming. Brenner explained that he had been working on farm equipment maintenance during the afternoon of October 3rd and hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. He mentioned that he had joined the search effort because Katherine's family were neighbors and he wanted to help. Richardson's report noted that Brenner seemed genuinely concerned about Katherine's disappearance and appeared tired from participating in multiple search shifts. The interview lasted approximately 20 minutes, and Brenner was not considered a suspect. The report was filed with hundreds of other routine interviews conducted during the massive effort. What Deputy Richardson couldn't have known was that less than 48 hours earlier, Brenner had buried Katherine Mitchell's body in a hand-dug grave on his family's property, concealed beneath the floor of an abandoned grain storage building that sat in a remote corner of the 40-acre farm. The grave was 4 feet deep, lined with lime that Brenner had stolen from a neighboring farm supply shed and covered with concrete mixed in small batches over 2 nights of careful work. As October turned into November and the corn harvest was completed, revealing empty fields that held no trace of Katherine Mitchell, the case began its inevitable transition from active search to cold case. Sheriff Walsh refused to give up, conducting follow-up interviews and reviewing evidence repeatedly through the winter of 1969. But without witnesses, physical evidence that could be properly analyzed, or any indication of where Katherine might have been taken, the case gradually went cold. Margaret Mitchell called the sheriff's office every single day for the first 6 months, asking if there had been any developments, any new leads, any reason to hope that her daughter might still be alive. Walsh took every call personally, explaining with patient compassion that the case remained active even as he understood that the likelihood of finding Katherine alive diminished with each passing day. Has something like this ever happened in your community, where a case went cold for decades, leaving families without answers? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure you hit that like button, because what happened next in the Mitchell family will show you just how devastating unsolved cases can be for the people left behind. Margaret Mitchell's obsession began with rituals that seemed reasonable to a grieving mother. She kept Katherine's bedroom exactly as it had been on October 3rd, 1969. Making the bed each morning with the same yellow quilted bedspread, dusting the collection of porcelain figurines on the windowsill, ensuring that Katherine's textbooks remained stacked neatly on her desk. The college application essays that Katherine had been working on stayed open to the page where she had stopped writing, her pen lying beside the notebook at the exact angle where she had placed it after completing the last paragraph. In the first months after Katherine vanished, this preservation felt like hope. Margaret told herself that Katherine would return to find everything waiting for her, that maintaining normalcy was a form of faith that would somehow call her daughter home. But as 1969 became 1970 and then 1971, the unchanged room transformed from a shrine of hope into a monument to loss. Thomas Mitchell began sleeping in the guest room, unable to pass Katherine's door each night and see Margaret sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Katherine's torn white blouse, which had been returned to the family after evidence processing was complete, whispering conversations with a daughter who wasn't there to answer. The blouse still showed the tears from where it had been ripped during Katherine's final moments, still bore the faint stains that forensic technicians couldn't completely remove during their analysis. The annual pilgrimage to Sheriff Walsh's office became Margaret's most sacred ritual. Every October 3rd, she would dress in her best outfit, drive the 12 miles to the Livingston County Sheriff's Department in Pontiac, and file a new missing persons report for Katherine Rose Mitchell. The law didn't require annual filings for missing persons cases, but Margaret had convinced herself that constant pressure was the only way to prevent Katherine's case from being forgotten. Walsh, and later his successor, Sheriff James Miller, received these visits with patient compassion, even as the reports became increasingly detailed and somewhat detached from reality. By 1976, Margaret's reports included elaborate theories about Katherine's disappearance that she had developed through extensive correspondence with other families of missing children across the Midwest. She became convinced that a network of criminals was systematically abducting teenage girls from rural areas, transporting them to cities for purposes she could never fully articulate, but clearly feared deeply. Her letters to the FBI grew more frequent and more desperate, filled with connections she had drawn between Katherine's case and missing person reports from Iowa, Indiana, and Wisconsin that shared only the most superficial similarities. Young women, approximately the same age, blonde or brown hair, rural locations, but the circumstances and timelines often didn't align in ways that would suggest connected crimes. Margaret couldn't see these inconsistencies. Her need to find patterns, to make sense of the senseless, had overridden her ability to assess evidence objectively. The psychological toll on the Mitchell family became evident to their rural community in ways that no one quite knew how to address. Thomas Mitchell, a man who had been known for his steady reliability and quiet humor, became increasingly withdrawn. He stopped attending church services, avoided social gatherings where well-meaning neighbors might ask about Katherine or Margaret's deteriorating mental state. Their marriage, which had been solid and affectionate before Katherine's disappearance, became a careful choreography of two people trying to grieve in the same house without acknowledging that their grief had taken incompatible forms. Margaret's obsession expanded beyond the annual reports to include maintaining detailed correspondence with psychics, private investigators who promised results for money the Mitchells couldn't afford, and amateur detectives who contacted her after reading about Katherine's case in true crime magazines that had begun featuring unsolved disappearances. She converted Katherine's room into an informal command center, covering the walls with maps marked with pins indicating where other girls had disappeared. Timelines written in her increasingly erratic handwriting. Photographs of men who had been arrested for similar crimes in other states. She spent hours each day reading newspaper accounts of missing persons cases across the country, cutting out articles and filing them in elaborate systems that made sense only to her increasingly fragmented thinking. Thomas would come in from working the fields to find Margaret surrounded by stacks of newspapers, her fingers stained with newsprint, talking rapidly about connections she had discovered between cases that had no actual relationship to Katherine's disappearance. The community's initial sympathy gradually gave way to uncomfortable avoidance. Margaret's behavior at church functions became unpredictable, sometimes involving tearful outbursts during hymns, other times manifesting as inappropriate laughter during serious moments when her mind had wandered to some memory of Katherine. The church ladies' auxiliary stopped including her in social activities. Not out of cruelty, but because her presence transformed every gathering into an occasion for discussing theories about Katherine's disappearance that had become increasingly disconnected from evidence or logic. Thomas Mitchell died of a heart attack in 1987, found by Margaret in the barn where he had been working alone on equipment maintenance. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but everyone in Chatsworth understood that Thomas had been dying slowly for 18 years. Worn down by grief and Margaret's refusal to accept that Katherine was never coming home, Margaret discovered his body at 2:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. Exactly 18 years after Katherine had left home for work on another Friday afternoon. Their son, Daniel Mitchell, had been 12 years old when his sister Katherine disappeared. Young enough that his memories of her were filtered through the lens of sibling rivalry and childhood misunderstandings. He remembered Katherine being annoyed when he borrowed her records without permission. He remembered her helping him with math homework, even though she claimed he was interrupting her own studying. By the time his mother Margaret died in 2020, succumbing to complications from dementia that doctors believed had been accelerated by decades of psychological trauma, Daniel had spent 51 years living in the shadow of a sister who had become more legend than person in their family's daily existence. Margaret's final years were spent in a nursing home in Bloomington, where Daniel visited her twice weekly. She no longer recognized him most days, but she spoke constantly about Katherine, about needing to file the annual report, about connections she had discovered between cases, about how everyone had given up except her. Daniel would sit beside her bed, holding her hand, and wonder if some part of his mother had actually died on October 3rd, 1969, even though her body had continued living for another 51 years. When Margaret died on March 12, 2020, Daniel faced the overwhelming task of sorting through the materials his mother had accumulated over 5 decades. The family farmhouse had become a repository for every document, photograph, and piece of correspondence related to Katherine's case. Margaret had filled filing cabinets, cardboard boxes, and plastic storage containers with her research, organized according to a system that made sense only to her deteriorating mind. But buried within Margaret's obsessive documentation, Daniel discovered evidence of genuine detective work that had been dismissed or overlooked by law enforcement agencies. His mother had maintained correspondence with families of missing girls across Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa, creating a network of shared information that revealed patterns no single jurisdiction had been able to recognize. Her maps showed clusters of disappearances that occurred during specific time periods in rural areas served by similar highway routes, suggesting the possibility of a mobile perpetrator who had never been identified because the crimes crossed multiple jurisdictional boundaries. Daniel Mitchell had inherited his mother's determination, but he possessed the emotional stability that 50 years of grief had gradually eroded in Margaret. He approached Katherine's case with the methodical mindset of someone who had spent his career as an accountant, understanding that solving complex problems required systematic analysis rather than intuitive leaps. He began by digitizing his mother's entire collection, scanning thousands of documents and photographs into a computer database that would allow him to search for patterns and connections that might have been invisible when scattered across physical files. The breakthrough came when Daniel contacted Detective James Morrison at the Illinois State Police Cold Case Unit in late 2023. Morrison had been reviewing unsolved cases from the 1960s and 1970s, specifically looking for cases where biological evidence had been collected but never properly analyzed due to technological limitations. When Daniel explained his systematic approach to organizing his mother's research and mentioned the evidence that had been collected from Katherine's torn blouse in 1969, Morrison immediately understood the potential. The more Detective Morrison delved into the original Katherine Mitchell case files, the more he discovered how close investigators had actually come to identifying David Allen Brenner as a suspect in 1969, and how a series of small failures, miscommunications, and bad luck had allowed him to remain free for 55 years. The first failure was jurisdictional. Katherine Mitchell had disappeared at the intersection of Highway 116 and County Road 1850, which sat exactly on the boundary line between Livingston County and Ford County. Sheriff Walsh from Livingston County had assumed primary jurisdiction because Katherine's family lived in his county and because he had received the initial missing persons report. But the Brenner property, where Katherine's body was actually hidden, sat 300 yards inside Ford County's boundary. Ford County Sheriff Dennis Hartley had cooperated fully with the search efforts, but his department had not conducted independent interviews of residents in his jurisdiction. The interview of David Allen Brenner, conducted by Deputy Richardson from Livingston County, had been brief and superficial. Had Ford County investigators conducted their own follow-up, they might have discovered inconsistencies in Brenner's timeline or noticed the fresh concrete that Brenner had poured in the abandoned grain building just days after Katherine's disappearance. The second failure was more subtle, but equally devastating. Detective Lieutenant Kowalski from the Illinois State Police had actually identified Brenner as a person of interest in November 1969, based on witness reports that placed Brenner's pickup truck in the area of Highway 116 during the time window when Katherine would have been riding her bicycle home from work. Kowalski had requested permission from Ford County to conduct a search of Brenner's property. The request had been approved, and a search warrant was issued on November 18, 1969. But administrative delays meant that Brenner wasn't notified of the pending search until November 20th. The actual search didn't take place until November 24th, giving Brenner nearly a week to prepare. During that time, Brenner had covered the fresh concrete in the grain building with dirt, straw, and old equipment, making it appear as though the building hadn't been disturbed in years. When investigators finally searched Brenner's property, they focused on the main farmhouse, the barn, and the immediately surrounding grounds. The abandoned grain building sat nearly 400 yards from the main structures, partially hidden by overgrown trees and vegetation. The search team walked past it without conducting a thorough internal examination. The search warrant had been limited in scope, authorizing investigation only for evidence directly related to Katherine Mitchell's disappearance, not for a comprehensive forensic examination of every structure on the 40-acre property. Years later, in 1994, Detective Patricia Myers from the EES, Illinois State Police Cold Case Unit, had reviewed the Mitchell file and identified the same concerns that had troubled Kowalski 25 years earlier. Myers had requested permission to conduct a follow-up interview with Brenner, who was then 48 years old and living in the same property where Katherine's body remained buried. But the request had been denied by her supervisor, who argued that pursuing a suspect based on decades-old suspicions without new evidence would be a waste of department resources and could expose the state to legal liability if Brenner complained about harassment. Myers had documented her concerns in a memo that was filed with the case materials, where it sat unread until Morrison discovered it in 2024. The third failure involved witness testimony that was collected but never properly analyzed. 3 separate witnesses had reported seeing a blue pickup truck parked near the intersection of Highway 116 and County Road 1850 on the afternoon of October 3, 1969. 2 of these witnesses had specifically mentioned noticing the truck because it was parked in an unusual location, partially hidden behind a stand of trees that bordered the road. David Allen Brenner owned a blue 1967 Ford pickup truck. This information was documented in Deputy Richardson's interview report. But nobody had connected the witness descriptions of the suspicious blue truck to Brenner's vehicle. The witness statements had been filed separately from the suspect interviews, and in 1969, before computerized case management systems, making such connections required manually cross-referencing hundreds of pages of documentation. Even more troubling was what Morrison discovered about Brenner's behavior in the months following Katherine's disappearance. In January 1970, Brenner had sold his blue pickup truck to a dealer in Bloomington and purchased a different vehicle. The timing was documented in vehicle registration records, but nobody had thought to question why Brenner had suddenly gotten rid of a truck that was only 3 years old and in good working condition. Morrison also discovered that Brenner had been involved in 2 other incidents that should have drawn law enforcement attention. In March 1971, a 17-year-old girl named Amanda Foster had reported being followed by a man in a pickup truck while she was walking home from work in Ford County. Foster had provided a description that generally matched Brenner's appearance, and she had noted that the truck had farm equipment in the bed, but the report had been filed as a suspicious person incident, not as a potential abduction attempt. No follow-up occurred, and no connection was made to the unsolved Mitchell case. In August 1974, Brenner had been arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct at a bar in Fairbury. The arrest report noted that Brenner had become aggressive with female patrons and had to be physically removed from the establishment. He had spent the night in jail and paid a fine. But again, no connection was made to the Katherine Mitchell case. The arrest occurred in a different jurisdiction, and the information was never cross-referenced with other law enforcement agencies. These failures weren't the result of incompetence or laziness. The investigators who worked Katherine's case in 1969 had been dedicated professionals who spent months conducting searches and interviews. Sheriff Walsh had personally reviewed the case files hundreds of times over his remaining years in law enforcement. Detective Kowalski had maintained an unofficial file on Brenner for years, documenting his suspicions even though he lacked the evidence to pursue an arrest. The failures were systemic. They were the inevitable result of working in an era before computerized databases, before interagency communication systems, before DNA analysis, and before the kind of forensic technologies that would eventually solve Katherine's case. They were the failures of a system that relied on paper files, manual cross-referencing, and the institutional memory of individual officers who might retire or transfer before crucial connections could be made. And they were failures that had allowed David Allen Brenner to live a normal life for 55 years, to marry, raise children, coach Little League, and become a respected member of his community. While Katherine Mitchell's body lay buried beneath concrete on his property, while Margaret Mitchell slowly lost her mind to grief and obsession, while Thomas Mitchell worked himself into an early grave, while an entire community lived with the unresolved trauma of a missing child whose fate remained unknown for more than half a century, the evidence that would ultimately solve Katherine Mitchell's case had been sitting in a climate-controlled storage facility in Springfield since 2002. That was when Livingston County had participated in a statewide initiative to transfer old case evidence from courthouse basements and sheriff's department storage rooms to centralized facilities operated by the Illinois State Police. The transfer had been part of a broader effort to preserve evidence in unsolved cases, driven by the recognition that advances in forensic technology were making it possible to analyze samples that had been useless in previous decades. DNA analysis had become standard procedure in criminal investigations by the 1990s, but the techniques for extracting genetic material from degraded or microscopic samples were evolving rapidly. Evidence that yielded no useful information in 1969 or even in 1999, might contain crucial forensic data in 2024. Detective Morrison had been conducting a systematic review of cases from the 1960s and 1970s, specifically looking for investigations where biological evidence had been collected, but never properly analyzed. The Mitchell case stood out immediately when he reviewed the evidence inventory. The torn white blouse, the fabric fragments with unknown biological material, the meticulous documentation by forensic technician Robert Martinez, whose detailed notes indicated that he had observed what might be skin cells or other tissue on some of the collected samples. In March 2024, Morrison had submitted a formal request to have the Mitchell evidence reanalyzed using the latest forensic techniques. The Illinois State Crime Laboratory had developed new methods for extracting DNA from fabric fibers, even when the biological material was degraded by decades of storage. The techniques involve specialized chemical treatments that could recover genetic information from samples that previous methods would have destroyed or contaminated. The laboratory technician assigned to the Mitchell case was Dr. Jennifer Park, a forensic biologist who specialized in cold case evidence analysis. Park had worked on more than 50 cold cases over her 12-year career, using advanced DNA extraction methods to solve crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. but even she was surprised by the quality of the genetic material recovered from Katherine Mitchell's torn blouse. The key was in the fabric fragments that Martinez had collected from the torn collar. When Katherine's blouse had been ripped during the struggle, the force had caused Brenner's hands to make direct contact with her neck and shoulder area. Skin cells from Brenner's hands had transferred to the fabric, becoming embedded in the cotton fibers. Those cells had remained there, protected by the fabric itself and by the careful evidence preservation, for 55 years. Dr. Park had used a technique called touch DNA analysis, which could extract genetic profiles from skin cells left behind by casual contact. The method had been developed in the late 1990s, but had become increasingly sophisticated over the following decades. By 2024, the technology could recover usable DNA profiles from samples containing just a few dozen cells. The genetic profile extracted from Katherine's blouse was partial but usable. It contained enough genetic markers to run through CODIS and make a comparison if a matching profile existed in the database. Park had submitted the profile in late October 2024, and the system had run its algorithms, comparing the Mitchell evidence against millions of other profiles collected from convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scenes across the United States. The match to David Allen Brenner's DNA had been nearly instantaneous. His profile had been entered into CODIS in May 2024, following his DUI arrest in April. Illinois law required DNA collection for all felony arrests and for certain misdemeanor offenses, including DUI. The sample had been processed routinely, with no particular attention paid to whether it might match any cold cases. The system had done what it was designed to do, running automated comparisons and flagging potential matches for human review. When Morrison received the notification of the match on that November morning, he immediately recognized the significance. Not just because it solved a 55-year-old case, but because of where David Allen Brenner lived. Morrison pulled up Brenner's current address and felt his stomach tighten. Rural Route 3, Chatsworth, Illinois. The same address listed in the 1969 interview conducted by Deputy Richardson. Brenner had never left. He had been living on the same property where Katherine's body was buried for the entire 55 years since her murder. Morrison spent the next 3 days building the case that would support Brenner's arrest. He reviewed every document in the original investigation file. He tracked down the few surviving witnesses and investigators from 1969. He obtained Brenner's complete criminal history, vehicle registration records, and employment information. He built a timeline of Brenner's whereabouts on October 3, 1969, and identified the gaps and inconsistencies in Brenner's original statement to Deputy Richardson. Most importantly, Morrison obtained a search warrant for Brenner's property, not the limited warrant that had been issued in 1969, which authorized only a search for evidence of Katherine's disappearance. This warrant was comprehensive. It authorized a complete forensic examination of every structure on the property, including ground-penetrating radar surveys and cadaver dog searches. It authorized the excavation of any areas where evidence might be concealed, and it was supported by probable cause based on the DNA match that connected Brenner directly to Katherine Mitchell's torn clothing. Morrison knew that finding Katherine's body would be crucial to building a prosecution case. The DNA evidence was powerful, but defense attorneys might argue contamination or innocent transfer, especially given the age of the evidence. Finding Katherine's remains would provide irrefutable proof that she had been on Brenner's property and would likely yield additional forensic evidence that could strengthen the case. He also knew that finding Katherine's body would finally provide closure to Daniel Mitchell, who had spent 51 years wondering what happened to his sister. And it would vindicate Margaret Mitchell's decades of obsessive advocacy, her refusal to let Katherine's case be forgotten, her insistence that someone in that community knew what happened to her daughter. The pieces were falling into place after 55 years of waiting. Detective Morrison assembled his team on November 14, 2024, in a conference room at the Illinois State Police Springfield headquarters. Present were Captain Rodriguez, forensic specialist Dr. Park, Ford County Sheriff Michael O'Brien, and FBI Special Agent Lisa Warren, who had been assigned to provide federal support for the arrest and potential prosecution. Morrison began by laying out the evidence. The DNA match was conclusive. The genetic profile extracted from Katherine Mitchell's torn blouse matched David Allen Brenner's DNA with a probability of 1 in 7 trillion. No defense attorney could argue coincidence with those numbers. But Morrison knew that solving a 55-year-old case required more than just DNA evidence. It required building a comprehensive narrative that explained how, when, where, and why Katherine Mitchell had been murdered. The how was becoming clearer as forensic analysts examined the original evidence with modern understanding. The tears in Katherine's blouse showed a pattern consistent with a violent struggle. The biological material found on the fabric suggested that Brenner had grabbed Katherine by the collar and shoulder, likely dragging her from her bicycle into his vehicle. The lack of blood evidence suggested that Katherine hadn't been killed at the abduction site, but had been transported elsewhere. The when was established by witness testimony and Katherine's known schedule. She had left Henderson's hardware store at 6:45 p.m. She had been seen riding her bicycle past the Jacobson farm at approximately 6:50 p.m. Her bicycle had been discovered, still slightly warm from use, at 8:47 p.m. The timeline suggested that Katherine had been abducted sometime between 6:50 and 7:15 p.m. on October 3, 1969. The where was the crucial question. Morrison believed that Katherine had been taken to Brenner's property, which sat less than 2 miles from the abduction site. The 1969 search of Brenner's property had been cursory and had focused on the main structures. Morrison suspected that Katherine's body was concealed somewhere on the property that hadn't been thoroughly examined during the original search. The why was perhaps the most troubling question, and one that might never be fully answered. Brenner had no apparent prior relationship with Katherine Mitchell. They weren't classmates, co-workers, or social acquaintances. The most likely explanation was that this had been an opportunistic crime. Brenner had seen a young woman riding alone on a rural road and had acted on violent impulses that might have been building for some time. If you're still watching, I want to hear from you. What would you do if you discovered that someone in your community had been hiding a secret like this for decades? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and let's continue with how investigators finally brought this monster to justice. Morrison's strategy for the search. Warrant execution was methodical. He wanted to avoid alerting Brenner before the team was in position to conduct both the arrest and the property search simultaneously. If Brenner realized that investigators were closing in, he might attempt to flee or destroy evidence. Morrison couldn't risk losing the opportunity to recover Katherine's remains after 55 years. The team included ground-penetrating radar specialists from the Illinois State Geological Survey, who could identify subsurface disturbances that might indicate buried remains. Cadaver dogs from the State Police K-9 unit, trained to detect human decomposition even after decades. and forensic archaeologists from the University of Illinois who specialized in recovering remains from burial sites while preserving any associated evidence. Morrison also coordinated with the Ford County State's Attorney, Patricia Holloway, who would be responsible for prosecuting the case. Holloway had been a prosecutor for 19 years and had handled numerous homicide cases, but never one where the crime had occurred before she was born. They discussed the challenges of prosecuting a case based on evidence collected 55 years earlier, with most of the original investigators deceased and witnesses whose memories had faded or become unreliable over half a century. The strongest element of the prosecution case would be the DNA evidence, which was objective and scientifically irrefutable. But Holloway wanted more. She wanted Katherine's remains recovered and identified through forensic analysis. She wanted evidence that placed Katherine on Brenner's property. She wanted to build a case so overwhelming that Brenner's defense attorneys would have no option but to advise their client to accept a plea agreement. On November 15th, Morrison conducted background research on David Allen Brenner's life since 1969. What he discovered was deeply disturbing. Brenner had married in 1972, 3 years after Katherine's murder. His wife, Patricia Brenner, still lived with him on the family property. They had raised 3 children, all now adults with families of their own. Brenner had worked various jobs over the decades, primarily in agricultural equipment sales and repair. He had coached youth baseball in the 1980s and 1990s. He served on the Ford County Planning Commission from 2003 to 2011. He was a member of the Chatsworth Community Church. By all external appearances, David Allen Brenner was a normal member of his community, a family man, a volunteer, someone who had lived an unremarkable life in the same rural area where he had been born. Nobody suspected that he had murdered a 17-year-old girl and buried her body on his property in 1969. Nobody suspected that he had attended her memorial service and had participated in searches for her body while knowing exactly where she was hidden. Morrison also discovered that Brenner had never left Illinois, had never moved away from the property where Katherine's body was buried. This suggested either remarkable arrogance or psychological compulsion. Most killers who successfully evade detection for long periods distance themselves from their crimes, moving to new locations and creating new identities. Brenner had done the opposite. He had stayed in the same place, living literally on top of his victim's grave, for 55 years. The psychological profile that FBI agent Warren developed suggested that Brenner likely experienced a sense of power and control from keeping Katherine's body on his property. Every day that he walked his land, every time he passed the grain building where she was buried, he was reminded that he had gotten away with murder, that he had successfully deceived investigators, family members, and an entire community, that he possessed a secret that gave him a sense of superiority over everyone around him. This psychological profile would become important during the interrogation strategy that Morrison and Warren developed. They would appeal to Brenner's arrogance, his belief that he had been smarter than everyone else for 55 years. They would suggest that the evidence against him was overwhelming, and that the only way to maintain any control over the situation was to cooperate and provide information about what happened to Katherine. They would offer him the opportunity to tell his side of the story, to explain himself, to be heard after keeping his secret for more than half a century. On November 17th, Morrison received approval from his supervisors to proceed with the arrest and property search. The operation was scheduled for November 19th. a Tuesday morning when Brenner would likely be home. The tactical plan involved simultaneous execution of the arrest warrant at Brenner's residence and the search warrant for the property. Multiple teams would move in coordinated fashion to secure Brenner, ensure the safety of his wife Patricia, and begin the forensic examination of the property. Morrison spent the evening of November 18th reviewing the case file one final time. He looked at Katherine Mitchell's homecoming photo, taken just 2 weeks before her death. He read Margaret Mitchell's desperate letters to the FBI, written over decades of fruitless searching. He reviewed Sheriff Walsh's meticulous reports, documenting an investigation that had been thorough by 1969 standards, but ultimately unable to solve the case with the tools available at the time. Tomorrow, Morrison would arrest the man who had stolen Katherine Mitchell's life and destroyed her family. Tomorrow, he would hopefully recover Katherine's remains and finally bring her home to rest beside her parents. Tomorrow, after 55 years, Katherine Mitchell's case would be solved. The convoy of law enforcement vehicles assembled at the Ford County Sheriff's Department at 5:45 a.m. on November 19, 2024. Detective Morrison conducted a final briefing with the 23 personnel involved in the operation. 6 officers would execute the arrest warrant at Brenner's residence. 4 forensic technicians would begin the property search. 3 K-9 units with cadaver dogs would conduct systematic sweeps of the grounds. 2 ground-penetrating radar specialists would scan areas identified as potentially disturbed. 4 forensic archaeologists would handle any excavation required. 2 FBI agents would assist with evidence collection and documentation. And 2 county prosecutors would observe to ensure all procedures were properly followed. The convoy departed at 6:15 a.m., traveling in darkness along rural roads toward the Brenner property. Morrison rode in the lead vehicle with Captain Rodriguez and Sheriff O'Brien. Nobody spoke. The weight of what they were about to do settled over the group like a physical presence. After 55 years, Katherine Mitchell's killer would finally face justice. The Brenner property looked exactly as it had been described in the 1969 reports. A weathered 2-story farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel driveway lined with mature oak trees. The barn that had appeared in old photographs was still standing, though its red paint had faded to a dull rust color. And approximately 400 yards behind the main structures, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation, stood the abandoned grain storage building that had been mentioned but not thoroughly searched in 1969. The arrest team moved into position at 6:48 a.m. Officers surrounded the house while Morrison, Rodriguez, and 2 Ford County deputies approached the front door. Morrison knocked sharply, announcing in a loud voice, "Illinois State Police, we have a warrant. Open the door." Lights came on inside the house. After approximately 90 seconds, the door opened. David Allen Brenner stood in the doorway wearing pajama pants and an old t-shirt, his gray hair disheveled from sleep. At 73 years old, Brenner looked like what he was, an elderly farmer in declining health. His face showed confusion, then recognition as he focused on the badges and weapons visible in the pre-dawn darkness. "David Allen Brenner?" Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, what's this about?" "Mr. Brenner, I'm Detective James Morrison with the Illinois State Police. I have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the murder of Katherine Rose Mitchell on or about October 3rd, 1969. I also have a warrant to search this property for evidence related to that crime. I need you to step outside and place your hands behind your back." For approximately 5 seconds, Brenner's face showed no expression. Then something changed. A flicker of recognition, perhaps. Or maybe resignation. Brenner glanced past Morrison toward the multiple vehicles now visible in his driveway, their emergency lights creating strobing patterns in the morning darkness. He looked toward the grain building in the distance, where flashlights were already moving as the search team began their work. "I want a lawyer," Brenner said quietly. "That's your right, Mr. Brenner. But right now, I need you to step outside and place your hands behind your back." Brenner complied without resistance. Morrison handcuffed him, while another officer read him his Miranda rights. Patricia Brenner appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock. She was crying, asking what was happening, saying there must be some mistake. An officer gently moved her back inside and began explaining that a search was being conducted and that she needed to remain in the house until it was completed. Brenner was placed in the back of Morrison's vehicle at 6:53 a.m. As officers secured him in the seat, Brenner stared out the window toward the grain building. Morrison watched his face carefully, looking for any reaction. Brenner's expression was unreadable. But Morrison noticed that Brenner's eyes never left that building, even as the vehicle began moving down the driveway toward the county jail in Pontiac. By 7:30 a.m., the cadaver dogs had indicated on the grain building. The canine behavior was unmistakable. Both dogs independently alerted to the same location inside the structure, where decades of accumulated dirt and debris covered what appeared to be a concrete floor. The ground-penetrating radar scan confirmed a subsurface anomaly consistent with disturbed soil beneath the concrete. Something approximately 6 feet long and 2 feet wide was buried there. The forensic archaeologists began their work at 8:15 a.m. They carefully removed the layers of dirt and debris, photographing and documenting each step. The concrete beneath was old, consistent with construction dating to the late 1960s or early 1970s. Jackhammers carefully broke through the concrete layer, revealing soil that was clearly different in composition from the surrounding earth. This soil had been disturbed, removed, and then replaced. It had settled differently. It contained materials, lime primarily, that weren't naturally present in the area. The excavation continued through the morning hours. At 11:47 a.m., a forensic archaeologist's brush revealed fabric, clothing that had been buried approximately 4 feet below the concrete surface. As more soil was carefully removed, the shape of human remains became visible. A body had been buried here, lying on its back, dressed in what appeared to be denim jeans and a dark-colored sweater. Detective Morrison received the call at noon. He was at the Ford County Jail, preparing to interrogate Brenner. When the forensic archaeologists confirmed that they had located human remains and that the clothing appeared consistent with what Katherine Mitchell had been wearing in 1969, Morrison felt a wave of emotion that surprised him. Relief, sadness, anger, and satisfaction that after 55 years, Katherine Mitchell was finally being recovered. The excavation continued through the afternoon. The remains were carefully documented in place before being removed for transport to the state medical examiner's office in Springfield. Preliminary examination at the scene confirmed that the remains were consistent with a female of approximately 17 years of age. The condition of the bones suggested that death had occurred many decades earlier. The dental structure was intact and could be compared to Katherine Mitchell's dental records for positive identification. Additional evidence recovered from the burial site included personal items that had been buried with the body. A small watch that matched the description of the watch Katherine's parents had given her for her 16th birthday. A school ring from Livingston Central High School, class of 1970, and fabric fragments that appeared to match the white cotton blouse that had been torn from Katherine during the abduction. At 3:27 p.m., Morrison entered the interrogation room where David Allen Brenner had been waiting with his court-appointed attorney. Morrison placed a folder on the table and sat down across from Brenner. He didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch, watching Brenner's face for any reaction. Finally, Morrison said, "We found her, Mr. Brenner. We found Katherine Mitchell buried in the grain building on your property. We have your DNA on her clothing. We have her remains on your land. We have 55 years of lies falling apart. So now is your chance to tell me what happened on October 3rd, 1969. Because this is the last opportunity you'll have to explain yourself before this goes to trial, and a jury hears the evidence without hearing your side of things." Brenner sat motionless for nearly 30 seconds. Then he turned to his attorney and whispered something inaudible. The attorney shook her head. Brenner whispered again. The attorney reluctantly nodded. "My client wishes to invoke his right to remain silent," the attorney said. "This interview is over." Morrison gathered his folder and stood. He looked down at Brenner, this elderly man who had successfully hidden his crime for 55 years, who had lived a normal life while Katherine Mitchell's family had been destroyed by grief, who had participated in searches for a body that he knew was buried on his own property, who had maintained his secret even as DNA technology advanced and cold cases began to be solved. Katherine Mitchell was 17 years old, Morrison said quietly. She was going to be a teacher. She was looking forward to homecoming the next weekend. She had her whole life ahead of her. And you took all of that away. You buried her like garbage in your grain building, and you let her family suffer for 55 years. I hope that every single day, for the rest of your life, you remember what you did." Morrison walked out of the interrogation room. David Allen Brenner was formally charged the following day with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and concealment of a homicide. The bond hearing was brief. Brenner was ordered held without bond pending trial. The prosecution argued that he was a flight risk and a danger to the community. The defense made no argument to the contrary. The news of Brenner's arrest shocked the Chatsworth community. Neighbors who had known him for decades appeared on local news broadcasts expressing disbelief. Patricia Brenner released a statement through her attorney saying that she had no knowledge of her husband's actions and was cooperating fully with investigators. Brenner's adult children issued a statement expressing sympathy for the Mitchell family and stating that they had been completely unaware of their father's crimes. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the few remaining residents who remembered Katherine Mitchell's disappearance in 1969. Dale Jacobson, who had discovered Katherine's bicycle that October night 55 years earlier, told a reporter that he had always suspected someone local was involved. "You don't snatch a girl off a road in the middle of farm country without knowing the area," Jacobson said. "Someone who knew these roads, knew the timing, knew when she'd be riding past. I always thought it was someone from around here. I just never imagined it was someone who'd helped us search for her." Daniel Mitchell received the call from Detective Morrison at 2:15 p.m. on November 19, 2024. Daniel was at his office in Urbana reviewing financial statements for a client when his cell phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. Morrison's voice was steady but emotional as he explained what had happened over the previous 24 hours. An arrest had been made. Katherine's remains had been recovered. After 55 years, 4 months, and 16 days, Daniel finally knew what had happened to his sister. Daniel sat in his office chair, phone pressed to his ear, listening to Morrison describe the evidence. The DNA match, the burial site, the personal items recovered with Katherine's remains, her watch, her class ring, the confirmation that this was really her, that the search was finally over. Daniel found that he couldn't speak. Words seemed inadequate for the mixture of emotions flooding through him. Relief that his mother's lifelong obsession had been vindicated. Grief that his parents had died without knowing what happened to Katherine. Rage at David Brenner for stealing his sister's life and destroying his family. And a strange, almost guilty sense of closure, as if accepting that Katherine was finally found meant accepting that she was really gone. "Your mother never gave up," Morrison said quietly. "All those years, all those reports she filed, all that research she did. She was right. Someone in that community knew what happened. And because she never stopped pushing, because she documented everything, we were able to solve this case. Your mother's dedication saved this case, Mr. Mitchell. I want you to know that." The formal identification of Katherine's remains took 3 days. The state medical examiner compared dental records from Katherine's high school file to the dental structure of the recovered remains. The match was positive. DNA extracted from the bone material was compared to Daniel's DNA, confirming familial relationship. On November 22, 2024, the medical examiner officially declared that the remains recovered from David Brenner's property were those of Katherine Rose Mitchell, deceased October 1969, homicide. The cause of death was determined to be manual strangulation, based on damage to the hyoid bone consistent with compression of the throat. Katherine had been strangled to death, likely during or immediately after the abduction. The medical examiner estimated that death had occurred within hours of Katherine being taken. She had not survived long enough to be reported missing. By the time Margaret Mitchell had called Henderson's hardware store at 7:30 p.m., her daughter was likely already dead. This information was devastating to Daniel in ways he hadn't anticipated. For 55 years, some part of him had held on to a childish hope that maybe Katherine had survived somehow, that maybe she had been taken somewhere and had lived some other life, even if she couldn't come home. Learning that she had died that same night, that she had never had a chance, that the panicked searches had been conducted while her body was already hidden in Brenner's grain building, it made the tragedy feel fresh and immediate in ways that Daniel struggled to process. The memorial service for Katherine Rose Mitchell was held on December 15, 2024, at the Chatsworth Community Church. More than 300 people attended, filling the sanctuary beyond capacity. Many were people who had participated in the original searches in 1969. Others were community members who wanted to honor Katherine's memory and show support for Daniel. Media representatives from across Illinois and from national news organizations covered the service, drawn by the extraordinary 55-year gap between Katherine's murder and the solution of her case. Daniel spoke during the service, standing at the pulpit and looking out at the crowded sanctuary. He talked about Katherine as he remembered her, his older sister who had helped him with homework, who had been annoyed when he bothered her, but who had always made time for him anyway, who had been planning to become a teacher, who had saved money from her hardware store job to buy textbooks for college, who had never gotten the chance to live the life she deserved. He talked about his mother, Margaret, whose obsession with finding Katherine had defined the last 51 years of her life, how she had been dismissed as unstable, as too emotional, as unable to accept reality, but how she had been right, how her insistence that someone knew what happened had been correct, how her documentation and research had ultimately helped solve the case. "My mother gave her life to finding my sister," Daniel said. "She lost herself in the search, but she never stopped believing that the truth would come out. And she was right." He talked about his father, Thomas, who had died of a broken heart in 1987, who had worked himself into an early grave trying to cope with the loss of his daughter and the slow mental deterioration of his wife, who had never known what happened to Katherine, never had closure, never got to see the man responsible brought to justice. And he talked about the importance of never giving up on unsolved cases, about the power of modern forensic science to reach back decades and solve crimes that seemed impossible, about the dedicated investigators who refuse to let cold cases remain cold, about the families who deserve answers even when years have passed. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," Daniel said. "It took 55 years, but Katherine finally has justice. The man who killed her is in custody. Katherine is finally home, and our family can finally have peace." Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments what you think about this case. After 55 years, do you think Brenner can get a fair trial? Share your thoughts below. After the service, Katherine Rose Mitchell was laid to rest in the Chatsworth Cemetery, beside the graves of her parents, Margaret and Thomas. The headstone that had been placed there in 1970, bearing only her name and the inscription, "Missing but Never Forgotten," was replaced with a new marker that included her birth and death dates. October 3rd, 1969. The day she had been taken, the day she had died, the day that had haunted her family for 55 years. Detective James Morrison attended the burial service, standing at a respectful distance from the family gathering. He watched as Katherine's casket was lowered into the ground, finally bringing her home after more than half a century. He thought about all the people who had worked this case over the decades. Sheriff Walsh, who had investigated until his retirement without solving it. Detective Kowalski, who had suspected Brenner but lacked the evidence to prove it. Detective Myers, who had tried to reopen the case in the 1990s but had been denied. All the officers, technicians, volunteers, and family members who had refused to let Katherine be forgotten. And he thought about Margaret Mitchell, who had filed those annual reports for 50 years, who had been dismissed as obsessed, as unstable, as unable to let go, but who had been the most important advocate Katherine could have had, who had kept the case alive through sheer force of will, who had documented everything, corresponded with everyone, and refused to accept that her daughter would never be found. Margaret Mitchell had died in 2020, 4 years before her daughter's killer was finally arrested. She had spent the last years of her life in a nursing home, her mind destroyed by dementia and decades of trauma. She had never known that she was right. She had never seen David Brenner arrested. She had never attended Katherine's funeral. She had never had the closure she deserved. But in a very real sense, Margaret Mitchell had solved her daughter's case. Her decades of advocacy had kept Katherine's name in the public consciousness. Her annual reports had kept the case file active. Her correspondence and research had documented information that proved useful to the final resolution. Her refusal to give up had inspired investigators like Morrison to take another look at cases that others had written off as unsolvable. Daniel Mitchell established the Katherine Rose Mitchell Foundation 3 months after his sister's burial. The foundation's mission was to support cold case investigations in rural communities and to advocate for families of long-term missing persons. The foundation provided grants to small law enforcement agencies for DNA testing and forensic analysis. It funded training programs for investigators working cold cases, and it provided support services for families dealing with the unique trauma of having a loved one missing for years or decades. The foundation also advocated for policy changes that would improve cold case investigation, better evidence preservation standards, mandatory review of unsolved cases when new forensic technologies became available, enhanced communication between jurisdictions to identify patterns that might be invisible to individual agencies, requirements for collecting and maintaining DNA samples from arrestees, expanding the databases that had ultimately solved Katherine's case. Katherine's death destroyed my family, Daniel explained during the foundation's launch announcement. My mother lost her mind to grief. My father worked himself to death. I grew up in the shadow of a tragedy that was never resolved. But Katherine's death can still have meaning. It can help prevent other families from experiencing what we went through. It can help solve other cold cases and bring closure to other people who are living with the same questions that haunted my family for 55 years. David Alan Brenner's trial was scheduled for September 2025, nearly a year after his arrest. Brenner had pleaded not guilty to all charges, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. His defense attorneys had filed numerous pre-trial motions, challenging the admissibility of the DNA evidence, arguing that the 55-year gap between the crime and the analysis created opportunities for contamination or degradation that made the results unreliable. But State's Attorney Patricia Holloway was confident in her case. The DNA evidence had been properly preserved, properly analyzed, and properly documented. The chain of custody was intact. The probability statistics were overwhelming. And the recovery of Katherine's remains on Brenner's property, buried in a location that Brenner had exclusive control over since 1969, provided corroborating evidence that made the case nearly impossible to defend. Brenner's wife Patricia had filed for divorce in January 2025. His 3 adult children had publicly disowned him. His grandchildren would grow up knowing that their grandfather was a murderer. The life he had built over 55 years, the reputation he had carefully cultivated as a normal member of his community, had collapsed completely in the space of a single day. In June 2025, facing the reality of the evidence against him and the likelihood of a conviction that would result in him dying in prison, David Alan Brenner accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and concealment of a homicide in exchange for the prosecution's recommendation of a life sentence without possibility of parole. He would avoid a trial. He would avoid the death penalty, but he would spend the rest of his life in prison. As part of the plea agreement, Brenner was required to provide a statement describing what happened on October 3, 1969. The statement was brief and lacked emotion, as if Brenner was describing something that had happened to someone else rather than a crime he had committed. Brenner admitted that he had been drinking on the afternoon of October 3rd, that he had driven around rural roads in his pickup truck, watching young women walking or riding bicycles, that he had seen Katherine Mitchell riding home from work and had followed her, that he had forced her off the road, grabbed her, and strangled her when she fought back, that he had panicked after realizing what he had done, that he had transported her body to his property and buried it in the grain building, then covered the grave with concrete to ensure it would never be discovered. The statement contained no apology, no expression of remorse, no acknowledgement of the devastation he had caused. It was a factual recitation of events, as if Brenner was describing a transaction rather than the murder of a 17-year-old girl. Daniel Mitchell attended the plea hearing. He sat in the courtroom gallery as Brenner stood before the judge and admitted his guilt. Daniel watched Brenner's face, looking for some sign of remorse, some indication that Brenner understood the magnitude of what he had done. He saw nothing. Brenner's expression was blank, almost bored, as if he wanted the proceedings to end so he could return to his cell. When the judge asked if Daniel wanted to provide a victim impact statement, Daniel stood. He walked to the front of the courtroom and faced David Brenner directly. And he spoke about Katherine, about the sister he had lost, about the parents who had been destroyed by grief, about the 55 years of questions and uncertainty, about the life Katherine never got to live, about the family that had been shattered by one man's selfish, violent act. "You took everything from us," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "You took my sister. You took my mother's sanity. You took my father's will to live. You took 55 years that we could have spent healing, and you turned them into 55 years of torture. And for what? Because you were drunk and you saw a young woman riding alone, and you decided that your desires were more important than her life? Because you were too much of a coward to take responsibility for what you did? You are a coward and a monster. And I hope you spend every day for the rest of your life remembering what you took from Katherine, what you took from all of us." David Allen Brenner showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead as Daniel spoke, his face expressionless. When Daniel finished, Brenner was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. He would be transported to Pontiac Correctional Center, where he would serve his life sentence. At 73 years old, with declining health, he would likely die in prison within a few years. As Daniel Mitchell walked out of the courthouse into the bright June sunlight, he felt a sense of completion that had been absent from his entire adult life. Katherine's case was solved. Her killer was in prison. She was buried beside their parents, her grave marked with a proper headstone. The boer, questions that had haunted his family for 55 years, finally had answers. It wasn't the ending anyone would have chosen. Katherine should have lived. She should have gone to college, become a teacher, married, had children of her own. Margaret and Thomas should have seen their daughter graduate, should have watched her live the life she deserved. The Mitchell family should have been whole. But after 55 years of uncertainty, after decades of obsession and grief and unanswered questions, there was finally resolution. Katherine Rose Mitchell could rest in peace. Her family could begin to heal, and her legacy would live on through the foundation that bore her name, helping to solve other cold cases and support other families searching for answers. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Even after 55 years, the truth had emerged. Even after more than half a century, Katherine Mitchell's killer had faced consequences. The system had worked eventually. Science had advanced. Dedicated investigators had refused to give up. And a family that had been torn apart by tragedy had finally found peace. If this story moved you, hit that like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel because I'll be covering more cases like this one, where decades-old crimes are finally being solved through modern forensics and the dedication of investigators who refuse to let these victims be forgotten. Katherine Rose Mitchell waited 55 years for justice. But justice finally came. And that has to mean something.